The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes with living in a small town nestled in the Italian Alps. I was called to the Lorenzi house shortly after 9 a.m. The dispatcher had described a frantic woman, screaming for help, her voice barely coherent. She claimed her young son, Samuel, was gravely injured. By the time I arrived, the helicopter had already landed, and paramedics were rushing the boy to the hospital. What I didn't know then was that this call would lead me into one of the most harrowing cases of my career. The house stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding within. It was well kept, pristine, the kind of home you'd expect from a family like the Lorenzis, quiet, hardworking, respected. But as I stepped inside, the facade of perfection began to crumble. Blood. It was the first thing I noticed. It covered the bedroom floor, the walls, even the ceiling. The scene was beyond anything I'd prepared for. Anna Maria Lorenzi, the boy's mother, was pacing in the hallway, her hands trembling, her face pale and streaked with tears. She kept muttering the same phrase, over and over, his head, it exploded. The neighbor, Daniela, stood nearby, her own face ashen. She had been the first to respond to Anna Maria's cries for help. The family doctor, who had arrived minutes before me, was packing his bag. His expression told me everything I needed to know. The boy hadn't made it. I moved upstairs to the bedroom where Samuel had been found. It was impossible to ignore the metallic smell of blood. The bed was soaked through, the sheets tangled and stained. Gauze bandages, hastily applied, lay discarded on the floor. Whatever had happened here wasn't an accident, it was violence, pure and unrelenting. The kind that leaves scars not just on the victims but on everyone who sees it. I stood for a moment, taking it all in. The splatter patterns on the wall suggested repeated, forceful strikes. A sharp object, wielded with terrifying precision and intent. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to indicate a fight. It was as though Samuel had been ambushed, caught unaware in a place where he should have felt safe. The injuries described by the paramedics, multiple fractures to the skull, deep lacerations, painted a picture I didn't want to believe. But the evidence was undeniable. Back downstairs, I interviewed Anna Maria. Her story was scattered, disjointed. She said she had woken up early, made breakfast for her husband, Stefano, and sent him off to work. She then got her older son, Davide, ready for school, walked him to the bus stop, and returned home to find Samuel covered in blood. He said he had a headache, she repeated, her voice shaking. I moved him to my bed so he could rest, and when I came back her voice broke. The neighbor, Daniela, corroborated parts of her account. She had heard Anna Maria's screams and rushed over, finding her covered in blood and clutching Samuel's body. But there were gaps, details that didn't line up. If Anna Maria had been at the bus stop, how had this happened in such a short span of time? And why was there no sign of forced entry? I spoke briefly with Stefano when he arrived. He was inconsolable, collapsing to his knees when I told him Samuel was gone. His grief was raw, unfiltered, the kind you couldn't fake. But Anna Maria's demeanor was different. She clung to him, whispering something I couldn't hear. At one point she looked up at me, her expression almost detached, and said, "We'll have another son." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. By midday, the forensic team had arrived. They began combing through the house, collecting samples, photographing the scene. I watched as they documented every inch of the blood-soaked room. It was a painstaking process, and every detail added to the growing sense of unease. The murder weapon was missing. No knife, no tool, nothing that could have caused the kind of injuries Samuel had sustained. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, taking the evidence with him. The more we dug, the more questions arose. Samuel's injuries were brutal, the work of someone filled with rage. But who? And why? There were no signs of robbery, no indication of a struggle. The Lorenzis had no known enemies, no debts, no history of violence. Yet here we were, standing in the aftermath of something monstrous. As I left the house that day, I couldn't shake the image of Anna Maria, her hands still trembling, her face a mask of grief, and something else I couldn't quite place. Was it shock? Guilt? Or was it something darker? I didn't know then, but I could feel that a storm was brewing, one that would test every instinct, every rule, every belief I held about justice and truth. And the worst part, this was just the beginning. The Lorenzi house was no longer a home, it was a crime scene, its walls bearing silent witness to an act of unfathomable brutality. My second day on the case began with a more detailed examination of the evidence, and with every step, the weight of what had happened here grew heavier. Samuel's room, the supposed sanctuary of a child, now felt like a mausoleum. The blood spatter told a story that no one wanted to hear. Analysts worked meticulously, mapping every drop, every arc, every stain. The patterns weren't random, they were deliberate, the result of repeated blows from a sharp object. A knife, perhaps. 18 wounds. It wasn't just an attack, it was overkill, the kind born of unrelenting rage or deep personal hatred. The ceiling bore faint streaks, a grotesque reminder of the force behind each strike. The walls, speckled with arterial spray, showed the trajectory of the weapon as it rose and fell. The blows had been inflicted with precision, as though the attacker wanted to ensure maximum damage. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was calculated, methodical, merciless. Yet, something didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints leading to or from the house, no fingerprints other than those of the family. The murder weapon was missing, as though the killer had vanished into thin air. It was the kind of puzzle that should have excited me as an investigator, but all I felt was a gnawing sense of dread. Anna Maria's account of that morning remained a web of contradictions. She insisted she had taken her older son, Davide, to the bus stop and returned to find Samuel already injured. She spoke of hearing his cries earlier, of him complaining about a headache. But the timeline was too tight. If she had truly been away for only minutes, how had someone entered the house, committed such a violent act, and escaped without a trace? Her demeanor was another enigma. She alternated between hysteria and eerie calm, her voice trembling one moment and flat the next. When I asked her to recount what she'd seen, she described Samuel's injuries in graphic detail, her tone detached, almost clinical. She insisted she had no idea who could have done this, yet her words carried an undercurrent of defensiveness, as though she anticipated being accused. Stefano, on the other hand, was a portrait of grief. He seemed genuinely devastated, his movements sluggish, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Who would do this to a child?" he asked me, his eyes rimmed with red. It was a question I couldn't answer, not yet. The neighbor, Daniela, added another layer of confusion. She described hearing Anna Maria's screams and rushing over to find her covered in blood, cradling Samuel's limp body. She kept saying his head had exploded, Daniela told me, her voice shaking. I've never seen anything like it. It didn't make sense. Daniela had entered the house briefly but fled almost immediately, overcome by the grisly scene. She had seen no one else, heard no unusual sounds. Just Anna Maria's cries and the unnerving stillness that followed. The family doctor's testimony was equally troubling. He had been the first medical professional on the scene, summoned by Anna Maria before the emergency services. He initially believed Samuel's injuries were the result of a medical condition, a cerebral aneurysm, perhaps. But upon closer examination, he realized the wounds were far too severe, too deliberate. Still, he hesitated to point fingers. She was covered in blood, he told me. But that's what you'd expect from a mother trying to save her child. The forensic evidence began to chip away at this assumption. Blood spatter analysis revealed that Anna Maria's clothing bore patterns consistent with proximity to the attack, not the kind of transfer you'd expect from someone cradling a wounded child. Her hair, too, contained microscopic traces of brain matter. It was a damning detail, one that hinted at a far darker possibility. The pajamas she had worn that morning were another piece of the puzzle. They were found behind the bed, crumpled and blood-stained. But the stains didn't match her story. They weren't smears or streaks from handling an injured child, they were spatter marks, consistent with the high-velocity impact of a weapon. Why had she changed out of them? And why had she hidden them? As the investigation deepened, other questions arose. Samuel's older brother, Davide, was interviewed. He confirmed his mother's timeline, stating she had walked him to the bus stop, and that Samuel had been fine when they left. But his testimony was hesitant, as though he was struggling to remember, or perhaps reluctant to speak. Could a 7-year-old truly understand the gravity of what had happened? Could he have been coached? I returned to the scene that evening, long after the forensic team had packed up. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart beat louder. I stood in the bedroom, staring at the blood-stained walls, trying to imagine the sequence of events. The violence, the cries, the silence that followed. Whoever had done this wasn't just a killer, they were something worse. This wasn't just murder, It was annihilation. A child's life, obliterated in moments. A family, broken beyond repair. And as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of me, hidden in the chaos, waiting to be uncovered. The Lorenzi family's grief unfolded in waves, each more devastating than the last. From the moment Samuel was declared dead, their lives were irrevocably changed. Stefano Lorenzi, a man known for his strength and composure, crumbled. He had rushed home that morning after Anna Maria's frantic call but arrived too late to see his youngest son alive. When the doctor confirmed Samuel's death, Stefano collapsed, his hands covering his face as he sobbed. It was a raw, unfiltered display of anguish that lingered in the air long after the moment passed. Anna Maria, on the other hand, was harder to read. In the hours following Samuel's death, she alternated between hysterical sobs and a strange, unsettling calm. While Stefano mourned openly, she seemed to retreat into herself, her responses to questions measured but devoid of emotion. Witnesses reported her saying, "We'll have another son," as though the void Samuel left behind could be so easily filled. She denied making the statement later, but the words hung in the minds of those who heard them, raising questions about her state of mind. For Davide, the older son, the loss of his brother was a wound he couldn't fully comprehend. At 7 years old, he was thrust into a storm of adult grief and suspicion, his childhood innocence stripped away. He became quiet, withdrawn, clinging to his parents as though they were the last anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Teachers at his school reported that he struggled to concentrate, his previously bright demeanor dimmed by the shadow of loss. The Lorenzi household, once a place of warmth and stability, now felt like a hollow shell. Stefano and Anna Maria tried to maintain a facade of normalcy for Davide, but the cracks were evident. The couple rarely spoke to one another except in whispers. Stefano's grief was raw, uncontained, while Anna Maria seemed locked behind a wall no one could penetrate. The tension between them grew with each passing day, unspoken accusations and unanswered questions festering like an open wound. The impact of Samuel's death rippled beyond the family, touching every corner of their small town. Cogne was the kind of place where everyone knew one another, where neighbors exchanged smiles and greetings on the street. Samuel's death shattered that sense of community. People whispered in hushed tones about the tragedy, their voices tinged with both sympathy and suspicion. The Lorenzi family, once admired and respected, now became the focus of morbid fascination. Parents in the town clutched their children tighter, their trust in the safety of their peaceful village eroded. How could such a horrific crime happen in their midst? Who could be capable of such violence? The unanswered questions fueled an undercurrent of fear that permeated every conversation. The sight of police cars outside the Lorenzi home only deepened the unease. The media descended on Cogne like vultures, their cameras and microphones turning the tragedy into a national spectacle. Headlines screamed of the Lorenzi horror, speculating on the identity of the killer and the motive behind such a heinous act. Reporters camped outside the family's home, capturing every anguished expression, every tear. The public's appetite for details seemed insatiable, their curiosity overshadowing the family's grief. Stefano bore the brunt of the media's scrutiny, his every action dissected and analyzed. Was his grief genuine? Could he have known more than he let on? The questions followed him everywhere, turning even mundane errands into a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Anna Maria, too, became a figure of intense speculation. Her stoic demeanor and inconsistent statements only fueled the public's doubts about her innocence. The strain took its toll on the Lorenzi family. Stefano withdrew from friends and colleagues, his once thriving career faltering as he struggled to balance work with the weight of his grief. Anna Maria became increasingly isolated, her world shrinking to the confines of their home. Even Davide, too young to fully understand the complexities of the situation, felt the distance growing between his parents. Amid the grief there was also anger. Stefano demanded answers, pressing investigators to uncover the truth about what had happened to his son. He attended every meeting, pored over every report, desperate for a shred of clarity. Anna Maria, however, seemed resigned. When questioned by authorities, her responses were vague, her recollection of events fragmented. Her behavior only deepened Stefano's frustration, the cracks in their relationship widening with each passing day. In the quiet moments, away from the prying eyes of the media and the questions of investigators, the Lorenzi family was left alone with their grief. Samuel's absence was a void they couldn't escape, a missing chair at the table, a silence that hung heavy in the air. His toys remained untouched, his laughter a memory that echoed painfully in their minds. For Cogne, the tragedy became a turning point. The town's sense of innocence was gone, replaced by a lingering shadow of suspicion and fear. The Lorenzi home, once a symbol of a happy family, now stood as a grim reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. For the Lorenzi family, and for everyone who knew them, life would never be the same again. The investigation into Samuel's death was a labyrinth of contradictions and unanswered questions. What had initially seemed like a straightforward, albeit brutal, case quickly spiraled into a tangle of doubt and suspicion. Every piece of evidence, every testimony seemed to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. Anna Maria's account remained the focal point. She insisted that she had taken Davide to the bus stop and returned to find Samuel covered in blood. She described the scene in vivid, harrowing detail, yet her words often contradicted the physical evidence. Investigators noticed her shifts in tone, her inconsistencies, and how she seemed to avoid direct answers when pressed. Was it grief clouding her memory? Or was it something more deliberate? The forensic analysis of the crime scene painted a picture far grimmer than anyone wanted to imagine. Samuel had suffered 18 blows to the head, each one deliberate, each one devastating. The weapon used was never found, but experts speculated it was a sharp object, likely a knife. The blood spatter patterns told a chilling story. The attacker had been close, striking with force and precision. Blood had even reached the ceiling, a testament to the violence of the act. One discovery stood out: a pair of Anna Maria's pajamas crumpled behind the bed. They were soaked in blood, but the pattern of the stains was troubling. The spatter marks suggested proximity to the attack, not the smearing that would come from holding a wounded child. Why had she hidden them? And why hadn't she mentioned them during her initial testimony? Her house slippers added another layer to the mystery. They, too, bore traces of blood on the soles, yet the surrounding floor was clean. It was as though she had stepped in blood, then carefully avoided leaving a trail. These details, subtle yet damning, began to shift the focus of the investigation. Davide's testimony was another puzzle. The boy confirmed his mother's timeline, stating that she had walked him to the bus stop, and that Samuel had seemed fine when they left. But his answers were hesitant, his tone uncertain. Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that he had been coached, or that his young mind was struggling to process the trauma. The broader picture grew more complicated as investigators probed the family's dynamics. Anna Maria's neighbors described her as meticulous to the point of obsession. She kept her house spotless, dressed impeccably, and took immense pride in her family's image. But behind the veneer of perfection, cracks had begun to show. A neighbor recalled a conversation in which Anna Maria had confided her struggles with Samuel, describing him as difficult and even unattractive. It was a chilling detail in hindsight. The forensic team also uncovered troubling inconsistencies in the physical evidence. For instance, there were no foreign fingerprints or signs of forced entry, ruling out the possibility of an intruder. The streets of Cogne had been busy that morning, with parents taking children to school and workers heading to their jobs. No one reported seeing anything unusual, no strangers, no suspicious movements. Whoever had committed the crime had done so with surgical precision, leaving no trace of their presence beyond the devastation they wrought. Bloodstain pattern analysts were brought in to reconstruct the sequence of events, a painstaking process that required mapping every drop of blood in the room. Their findings suggested that the attacker had been seated or kneeling on the bed, striking downward. This position aligned disturbingly well with where Anna Maria would have been standing based on the evidence. The missing murder weapon was a constant thorn in the investigation. Despite exhaustive searches of the house, the property, and the surrounding area, it was nowhere to be found. Investigators speculated that the killer had taken it with them, but if that was the case, it raised another question. How had they left without being seen? The absence of bloody footprints or trails pointed to someone who had cleaned up meticulously, or someone who had never left the house at all. As suspicion began to turn toward Anna Maria, her behavior came under increasing scrutiny. Witnesses described her as detached, even cold, in the days following Samuel's death. Her comment about having another son was repeated in whispers, casting a shadow over her grief. Stefano, her husband, stood by her publicly, but privately he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about his wife. A psychological evaluation revealed a history of anxiety and perfectionism, exacerbated by postpartum depression following Samuel's birth. While her mental health struggles were not uncommon, they added another dimension to the case. Could the pressures of maintaining her family's image, combined with her own vulnerabilities, have driven her to the unthinkable? Or was this merely an attempt to build a narrative around her guilt? The turning point came when investigators conducted a series of reenactments using a mannequin to replicate Samuel's injuries. Experts demonstrated that the blood spatter on Anna Maria's pajamas could only have occurred if she had been directly involved in the attack. The positioning, the angle, the velocity, all of it pointed to one conclusion. But without the murder weapon or a confession, it wasn't enough to charge her outright. The case continued to grip the nation. Media coverage was relentless, with every new piece of evidence dissected in excruciating detail. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Anna Maria as a grieving mother, unfairly targeted by a system desperate for answers. Others believed she was hiding something, her carefully crafted image cracking under the weight of scrutiny. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the investigators mounted. They were no closer to identifying the killer. Yet all the evidence seemed to circle back to Anna Maria. The lack of an alternative suspect only deepened the sense of frustration. This wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about restoring justice, about making sense of a tragedy that defied comprehension. By the end of the fourth week, the case had reached a boiling point. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Anna Maria remained in her home, surrounded by whispers and suspicion. The small town of Cogne, once a picture of tranquility, was now a community divided. And as I stood outside the Lorenzi house that evening, staring at the darkened windows, I couldn't escape the feeling that the truth was still out of reach, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The trial of Anna Maria Lorenzi was as much a spectacle as it was a quest for justice. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and onlookers who had followed the case since that fateful January morning. Prosecutors presented their evidence methodically, the blood spatter patterns, the inconsistencies in Anna Maria's testimony, and her unusual demeanor after Samuel's death. They painted a picture of a woman driven to violence by the pressures of perfection, her image unraveling under the weight of mental strain. Anna Maria's defense, however, fought back with vigor. They questioned the reliability of forensic techniques, pointing out the newness of bloodstain pattern analysis in Italy. Her lawyer introduced alternative theories: a mysterious intruder, a tragic accident, casting doubt on the prosecution's narrative. They argued that Anna Maria's behavior was not guilt but the fragmented response of a mother overwhelmed by grief and trauma. When the verdict came, it was both expected and shocking. Anna Maria was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The decision divided public opinion. Some saw justice served, others believed an innocent woman had been wrongfully condemned. But the twists didn't end there. Over the years, appeals and new trials reduced her sentence. Psychological evaluation cited her mental health struggles, particularly postpartum depression, as mitigating factors. In 2013, Anna Maria was released under house arrest, her sentence further shortened for good behavior. By 2019, she was free, living with Stefano and their surviving children in a new town far from the shadow of Cogne. The Lorenzi house, once a symbol of familial perfection, was sold. The small community of Cogne never fully recovered from the tragedy, its residents haunted by unanswered questions. Even today, whispers persist. Some still believe in Anna Maria's innocence, convinced that the real killer walks free. Others are certain she escaped full justice, her punishment never matching the gravity of the crime. For those who lived through it, Samuel's death remains an open wound, a scar that time cannot fade. And for Anna Maria Lorenzi, the question lingers: was she a victim of circumstance or the architect of a nightmare no one can forget?